I just like to do that. Sorry about that. So tonight, and if you're having trouble getting, how many are not on Slack? I mean, is that a bad question? How many are on Slack? Okay, those of you who aren't and need help because it's kind of wonky or something, would you talk to Landry or someone that's in Ratio Christi to help you get on Slack? Because it's kind of our thing, how we communicate. So tonight, our topic is the problem of animal suffering. And it's going to be maybe some wonky things we discuss that you go, and we're going to do about half scripture, half Bible. So our aim tonight is threefold. We're going to explain the problem of animal suffering and explain why it matters and provide a solution. So the argument, the problem of animal suffering is an argument against God's existence, and it kind of goes like this. This is short form. If God exists, he is all-powerful and all good, and he would prevent animal pain and suffering. However, there exists vast amounts of animal pain and suffering. Therefore, God does not exist. So it's really targeted towards anyone, Christians especially, who believe that God exists and he's all-powerful and all good. And what they're saying is, you have some explaining to do because animal suffering isn't very consistent with your view of the nature of God. So how are you going to explain that as a Christian? But first of all, what do we mean by animal suffering? There's a lot of things in this, and we're not going to touch on everything. I'm mainly going to touch on predation and like deadly parasites, diseases, that kind of thing with animal suffering. I'm not going to really get into cosmic events that cause mass extinctions or sort of natural evils, natural phenomenon like fires and hurricanes and tornadoes and everything like that, natural evil. I'm not going to. So we're kind of narrowing our focus because of our time limit. So that's the problem. Why does it matter? And this YouTube, I highly recommend you watch it. They're skeptics and atheists, and really it is about the four of them, which is Alex O'Connor, Joe Schmid, Peter Singer, and Ken Williford. And they claim that this argument is now the biggest problem for Christianity. And they rank it just as a top-tier argument against God's existence. In other words, it's like a deal-breaker argument, which I think all of the problem of evil as a big umbrella is kind of that way. Micah talked about the hiddenness argument, the hiddenness problem, which was last week. I find that a deal breaker and also in the problem of evil. And animal suffering goes right along with that. So it's a problem because it would prevent these guys from really examining the evidence for God. Anyone who's skeptical or an atheist, they might have this as a problem that never gets answered, and so they won't investigate the existence of God. And also it might just, people who have a vague idea of God, they might conclude that, well, it looks like God's evil, or at any rate that God's not good and not all good. And then another problem would be someone might conclude that God's power is limited. He can't do anything about animal suffering. And believers can also doubt God's goodness in this area if they don't get good answers. And it may cause believers to deconstruct their faith completely. So are you feeling it as a problem yet? Is it when we talk about it this way, that it prevents people from either pursuing God or understanding the gospel, it is a problem, right? But let's check in with Alvin. Our friend Alvin, the atheist, who we like very much, he has been watching that video and other essays and articles on animal suffering. So he's asking Carol, he said, how could your God allow the vast amount of animal pain and suffering? Well, what is she going to say? Carol has this answer. She says, well, I just trust that God has good reasons for allowing animal suffering, but I'm not in a position to know the reasons. Have you ever heard that? It's a common reply to any kind of problem of evil topic. It's kind of like skeptical theism. Like, God has reasons, but how could we know what they are? We're not in a position to know. Now, first of all, do you think this is a good answer that she's got right out of the bat when he brings this up? Did you find it satisfying, Aiden?
I've gotten this answer a lot from pastors when I ask questions, and every time I do, whenever I ask a difficult question as a Christian, it feels like a cop-out.
So it kind of, to me, feels like she's hand-waving it away a little bit, because it kind of seems like she hasn't done any homework or thought about it, and this is the easiest thing for her to say. So I give it a thumbs down. Now, I think you could end up with this answer, but I don't think you should start there, especially with your friend here. I don't think that's the way to go. So we're going to do a little bit. That's not going to be our first answer. So what are some of the causes of why this is a problem for Christians? First of all, the focus of the Bible is mostly on God and humans, and not necessarily on this question or answering this question. So not a lot is we don't have a lot of information, and we don't have explicit answer to the question. But we do know that God cares about animals. In Jonah 4:11, I always thought it was interesting that when God didn't destroy Nineveh because they repented, remember? And who was mad? Who was pissed off? Jonah. Jonah said, why, God? Why didn't you wipe them out? Because they're so sinful and terrible. And God says, and should not I, this is in Jonah 4:11, and should not I pity Nineveh, the great city, in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left? He's talking about infants and small children. And also much cattle. So he cared about the cattle in Nineveh, all right? And then, of course, we have in Matthew 6, he says, look at the birds, I provide for them. They need food, and I provide it, and do you not know you're even more valuable than them, and I value them highly. So we have we have examples of God caring for animals, but we also have, it's kind of a mixed bag. Did animals die in the flood, if you believe in the flood? Like innocent animals, we had a lot of them on the ark, but a lot of them died in the flood. And then we have God commanding the Israelites to kill animals in Canaan in the conquest. Not only were they supposed to kill the men of Canaan, but they were also to kill the animals. So we have that to deal with. And then we have animal sacrifices that were instituted by God, right? So it's a mixed bag, and it's complicated, and maybe those things that I just brought up we can talk about in the afterthought, because I'm not going to actually cover those in this talk. I know, I'm sorry. Can't cover everything. Plus, I don't really have good answers for those last few things. So, but if we grant the evidence from natural history, then we have animal death before the human fall for millions of years, like predation, parasites, diseases, cosmic events. We have all that happening for millions of years before the fall of man. And we've talked about this. We have presentation in our YouTube channel about that Christians can disagree about like the age of the earth and also interpreting Genesis. And so what I'd like to say is that old earth creationists and like evolutionary creationists largely find the data about the animal death before the fall. They don't have, they grant these findings. But if you happen to be young earth, I would just suggest that you grant this fact for the sake of your interlocutor, because the best way to say it is that we don't, for this conversation, that's a hill we're not going to die on, because it's a whole other thing to argue for. So I think we would just grant that this is the case, that there's millions of years and there's animal suffering before the fall of man. And this is a problem. And what I'd like to give you, just as a way of sort of evidence, in Genesis, there's some clues in Scripture that hint that the world outside the garden had already been corrupted before man is even on the scene. First of all, who's in the garden tempting Adam and Eve, tempting Eve? Who is it? The serpent, or the Revelation reveals that the serpent is Satan, right? So he's already he's a spiritual being, and he had already fallen before we see Adam and Eve enter the picture. So that's the first clue that something's going on outside the garden that may not be perfect, like we have God planting the garden with Adam and Eve in it, right? In Genesis 2:15, God instructs Adam to cultivate and keep the garden, and the Hebrew word there for keep is samar, and it means to guard the garden, to guard it, which is interesting. And then in Genesis 1:28, God told Adam and Eve to rule over the animal kingdom and subdue it. And that word is kabas, subdue. Both those terms, those Hebrew terms, are like battle terms, right? So they're battle terms inferring that the world outside the garden would have to be subdued, that there was something going on outside the garden. So God intended for Adam and Eve to expand the sacred space of Eden to all the earth. Those are the clues we have, and we're inferring, but those are clues for you for this second piece. One of the prevailing explanations for moral evil in the problem of evil is the free will defense, which is namely that free actions of humans are responsible for moral evil. But it doesn't really make that much sense for animal suffering and natural evil. It doesn't work well. So this typical theodicy fails on this topic. And then we have Augustine, who's very influential, and he said this. This is in the City of God, if you've ever read City of God. Everything somehow fits into God's secret plan and divine blueprint. Whether ordained or allowed, there's a specific divine reason for every occurrence in history. If God didn't prevent it, he must have had a good reason for not doing so. What does that sound like? Who did we just... It's almost like Carol had been reading Augustine, right? So Carol's response is kind of Augustine's response. And a lot of people for many, many years took that as the response to problem of evil and for this topic. So some theologians and philosophers argue, this is the last one about animal pain. Aquinas, Descartes, Richard Swinburne, William Lane Craig, they've argued that animal suffering isn't a problem because animals don't have the capacity to suffer in a morally significant way, like us. So animals aren't sentient as we are, so they kind of downplay the suffering. It's okay, animals suffering, but they're just not They don't suffer in a morally significant way, so we don't have to worry about it. I don't actually like this answer, and it is their answer to animal suffering. More evidence today shows that animals do experience pain in varying degrees based on their sentience, meaning they can feel, they have subjective experience of feeling pain. And that doesn't mean they have complex consciousness to be self-aware and the ability to reason or think like we do, or have thoughts about their thoughts or things like that. But the ability to feel pain, I feel like it's obvious that God gave it to them because it's helpful for survival. If we can't feel pain, we're not going to last very long, right? And it's the same with animals. So I think the real problem is the violent predation part. Okay. So those are kind of the problems we've had with talking about this topic. So what to expect from the solution I'm going to give you? I have bad news, because it's not going to be like I'm going to give you a package with a bow, wrapped up in a bow, and everything's figured out and you don't have any more questions. And it's not like we're going to go, go ahead, beat the hell out of animal. We're not going to be able to do that at the end, right? We would like to, but instead, it's more like a can of worms. And I'm sorry about that, but it is. But I just took one worm, and we're going to deal with one worm. Oh, I meant to buy gummy worms for us tonight. Dang it, I forgot to do that. Okay, that would be really funny, wouldn't it? Okay, anyway, we're going to do one worm out of the can. All the other worms can stay in, but we can get the other worms out in the afterthought. We can get the worms out. We're just not going to be able to cover them here. Okay. So here's the solution, and it's called the fallen angel theodicy. It's not new. This is not new. So this is an old idea. But it's that the problem of animal suffering could have originated from the free will of the first created spiritual beings, which weren't us, right? There were spiritual beings created before us. In fact, in Job 38, God tells Job that these spiritual beings, he called them the sons of God, shouted for joy when he laid the foundations of the earth. So when he was creating the world, these angels were already made. They already existed. So these spiritual beings have free will, intellect, creativity, and guess what? Responsibilities. They're part of God's, what we would call his divine counsel. And you can remember that word. We're going to talk about it a little more. And then later in the semester, Addie's going to give a whole presentation on the divine counsel. But we could reasonably presume that they were given responsibilities to guide and care for the developing animal kingdom, among other things. And this is similar to the way God gives mankind responsibilities, because we're made in his image, over creation, right? So it's the same idea. What you know God is doing for human beings to have responsibility over the creation, he first did it for the spiritual beings. So Satan, the first rebel, and perhaps other spiritual beings with him, rebelled against God and likely directly corrupted or neglected God's good plan, God's divine plan. So through either actions, direct actions, or their negligence, which we would call omissions, they failed to guide the development of the animal kingdom. Okay? So there's two options for the fallen angel theodicy now, this year, because this second option just came about in a paper that was published in April 2025. But the demonic action theodicy is just the idea that spiritual beings have corrupted God's creation by direct action. They meddled in the creation. The omission theodicy, which is the one that I prefer, fallen spiritual beings have indirectly corrupted God's creation by neglecting their responsibilities. And these are the two guys. Brian Cutter is at Notre Dame. And guess what, Harry? Philip Swinson went to William and Mary.
I was literally sending it to my William and Mary Apologetics Club right now.
Yeah. Do you know him? Do you know this guy?
Why
Okay.
is he there?
I think he's still there.
Oh, well, I never met him. He certainly never attended an apologetics meeting.
He's very interesting. I mean, they do a podcast together on this very topic together. And anyway, Harry went to William and Mary. Okay, I thought you would like that. This paper just came out in April, so this isn't. You won't even see very much talked about this yet because it's pretty new. But let's go back and look at the church fathers. So the main thing I want us to learn about this is that they did understand that God exercises general providence of the whole creation, but he lets spiritual beings, he appoints them to control particular parts of creation. So Justin Martyr's first, he said, God appointed angels as morally responsible agents in charge of administering segments of his cosmos. But the angels transgressed this appointment. Okay, that's in his book, Apology 5. Athenagoras says, some free agents you will observe, such as they were created by God, continued in those things for which God had made and over which he had ordained them, but some outraged both the constitution of their nature and the government entrusted to them. And Tertullian says, diseases and other grievous calamities are the result of demons whose great business is the ruin of mankind. And Origen is the last one, and he says, every particular aspect of the earth, from the growing of fruit to the flow of streams and the purity of the air, are under the agency and control of certain beings whom we may call invisible husbandmen and guardians. So that was Origen. And the way I just sum up by saying nature and the animal kingdom are a mixed bag. Perhaps you've noticed that. They reflect both God's creativity and the corrupting influence of demonic powers. So, the modern proponents of this theory are C.S. Lewis, J.R. Tolkien, and Alvin Plantinga. And there's others too. These were the main ones. C.S. Lewis says, it seems to me, therefore, a reasonable supposition that some mighty created power had already been at work for ill on the material universe before man ever came on the scene, and that when men fell, someone had indeed tempted him. If there is such a power, as I myself believe, it may well have corrupted the animal creation before man appeared. And that's in Problem of Pain. J.R.R. Tolkien, has anybody ever read The Silmarillion? Okay, so if you like Tolkien, you'll like this. So Tolkien has an origin story, the creation story, in the Silmarillion. And I'll just summarize it for you, because it seems a lot like this. Eru, who is God, he first created the Ainur. Is that how you say it? Ainur, the angels, the spiritual beings. And what he did was he wrote music for them to sing, and then they sang creation into being based on his music that he wrote. So, but this is what happened with okay. Well, I'm sorry. Wait a minute. Anyway, Melkor, well, y'all, I'm missing a piece of paper. Well, that's just sad. Okay, well, I'll have to just remember what it says. Melkor, who's like the Satan in Middle Earth, right? Kind of like Sauron is a distant relative of Melkor. He's going, yeah. Melkor, what did he do in this when they began to sing? Do you remember? Oh, you don't know. Okay. He began to sing minor and other tunes of his own, not the music that God had given them, right? And so that is that's Tolkien's view. What? Oh, I don't know what it. Okay, yeah. Here's what he said. Thank you. But as the theme progressed, it came into the heart of Melkor to interweave matters of his own imagining that were not in accord with the theme of Eru's God. For he sought to increase the power and glory of the part assigned to him. Okay, so that gives you a flavor of. I just find that interesting that he puts that in the Silmarillion. And then Alvin Plantinga said, and he doesn't develop this argument, but this is in his book Where the Conflict Really Lies. And he says, it is possible that demons actively corrupted the animal kingdom and nature. That's just his that's even pretty much all he says. He doesn't develop it at all. So, okay, how are we so far? Clarification or comment? Questions? Anybody? So we have the problem, we could have why it matters, and we have some church fathers and modern proponents advocating for this kind of crazy idea that fallen angels have meddled in creation, right? Okay. So, also a Tolkien quote was, do you remember when, do y'all know The Lord of the Rings? I'm getting blank. Only some of you? Okay, gosh, I'm getting old here. Okay, so remember that after the ring was destroyed, Sam, after they're rescued by the eagle, and Sam wakes up and he says, is everything sad going to come untrue? What's happened to the world? And Gandalf says, a great shadow has departed, that meaning evil. And do we still have that question? Well, wait a minute, is all the animal suffering going to be redeemed somehow? Is it going to be justified that they had to endure all this evil from fallen angels? What's that all about? So what we'd like to say is that there can be no theodicy without an afterlife, and this is the famous saying of John Hick, and he was all about soul-building theodicies for the problem of evil. And so what we can say, to some degree, all of creation is oppressed by demonic powers and needs to be reconciled to God. So God will ultimately defeat the evil of animal suffering. And redeemed creation will have peace and harmony between animals and between humans and animals. And these are the verses for that, and I have that in your handout too. But Romans 8, in Isaiah is the one you've probably heard. The wolf will lay down with the lamb, and the leopard shall lay down, that there's not going to be predation on the redeemed earth. But in Romans 8 it says, for the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. Now, there's continued debate over whether God's going to redeem some or all of the animals. That's just a thing we could talk about, but we don't know. So let's talk a little bit about the divine council. There's a hierarchy of beings. The first being Yahweh, God, is over all. The sons of God, what I talked about, they are the ones who are involved in the governance of creation, the divine council. And then the angels, angel actually just means messenger, so they are messengers. That's their job. They're not involved in the governance part. And we also know that as believers, we're actually going to join the divine council in the afterlife. And actually, there were, I'm going to get to this, but in Deuteronomy 32, there's a verse there about God giving the nations, remember Babel? And everyone was scattered, and God made people into nations. And he appointed sons of God to guide and rule the nations on his behalf, govern the nations. But they did a really bad job, and they rebelled, and some of them rebelled, and he's going to judge them, and that's in Psalm 82. But I think Addie might be talking some about that later. And we can talk about it if you want to talk about the divine council. So there is this hierarchy of spiritual beings. And they have responsibilities. Especially the sons of God have responsibilities. I mean, the angels have responsibilities to be messengers, but as far as governance. So in Job 38, as I already said, they were created before God created the world. And then in 1 Kings 22, it talks about how this divine council works. So do you remember Ahab, good old bad Ahab? I mean, remember him? God in 1 Kings 22, he gathers the divine council and he says, Ahab, it's time for Ahab to die. He's decreed that Ahab's going to die. And then he says, how is this going to be accomplished? And the sons of God give him like answers, how it should be done. And one guy says, well, I'll put a lying prophecy in the mouth of his prophets, and this causes his downfall and his death. And God says, okay, make it so. He likes that idea. And so that son of God, that angel goes, and a spiritual being goes, and Ahab dies. So it's like God made the decree, that was his will, and then they fulfilled it in a way that he agreed to. Does that make sense? We don't normally think of God as doing stuff like that, but that's in 1 Kings 22. And then in Job 1:6, right? Satan comes to the council in Job 1, and God says, have you considered Job? He's very righteous, and Satan challenges him on that and says, well, he's only righteous because you bless him, right? And so God says, okay, you can cause suffering for Job, but also he gave him limits. So God was still sovereign over it all, but Satan was the one coming. Satan actually came to the council, even though he's not part of the council. We see him coming and challenging what God was saying. And here is that Deuteronomy 32, that God divided mankind at Babel according to the number of the sons of God, and then God had to judge their rebellion later. So that's responsibility. So if we see that happening, these are our sort of clues. We can assume that some free spiritual beings have the responsibility to prevent the animal suffering we find. Maybe. We could infer that. If they're given governance in this way, perhaps they were giving governance over the animal kingdom and did a really bad job. So let's get to some objections. Why would God give this job to spiritual? Why is God doing this? Why does God give responsibility to these guys? Angels, like humans, aren't simply programmed to act in their roles without thought. God intended that they freely choose to serve God and worship Him. And the created spiritual beings aren't autonomous. God is over them, but He does give them responsibilities. And their actions have consequences, as we've seen, just like our actions have consequences. And it's almost like, so God gives us responsibility and free will to choose, right? We freely choose to serve and worship God, too. So it's the same idea if you think of it that way. Hold on. This is Cartman. Do y'all know who Cartman is? Do we not have South Park? Okay, we have South Park. Hold on. I don't believe all that Satan stuff, and that's what Alvin might have said that to Carol. Wait a minute, you're getting all goofy on me. You can't give that kind of answer to me. But remember, the claim and the argument is a problem for Christians. They're saying that if you believe in God, you have a problem because it's not consistent with animal suffering. It's your problem to answer. So she's saying, I'm giving the solution that's within my Christian worldview, and I do believe in God and angels and demons. So it's not off limits to me to have that in my solution. Now, we can say it's speculative, right? I mean, I would tell Alvin, yeah, we're speculating, we're inferring from some biblical data, but it's speculation. And we could be wrong. I could be wrong. So don't be afraid when you're talking about something that's speculative to say you could be wrong. And so the other objection is, wait a minute. Are you saying spiritual beings don't have their spirits, right? How are they interacting with the world anyway? Aren't they flying around in heaven, being invisible and stuff? Well, we have biblical evidence that when spiritual beings interact with humans in the material world, they can assume human form. So do you remember in Genesis 18 is when Abram is visited by two angels and also Yahweh. And guess what? They eat together. So they weren't visions. They appeared as men to Abram. And in Genesis 19, we have two angels that visited Lot here. And he assumed they were men until their actions proved otherwise. He blinded the people there in Sodom. He struck them with blindness. So, in Genesis 32, Jacob wrestles with God. I mean, it actually hurt him. So it's not like it was a spirit. It was a man, human form, I should say. So in Acts 12, when Peter's in prison, he's chained up. And an angel comes and nudges Peter awake, takes his chains off, and also opens the iron gate without touching it. In Matthew 28:2, an angel moved the stone from Jesus' tomb. So those are spiritual beings acting on material world and appearing as. So what I'm saying is, we have some clues in the text that they don't just stay in. They're not just heavenly spiritual beings flying around doing spirit stuff. When they interact with humans, they can take on human form. Okay. Also, I'm not sure why that's not looking just right. Sorry about that. Here's some other clues. And this is just biblical data to show you that Satan is involved in the world, and even we'll talk about what Jesus said about Satan's work. But he's described as the Lord of the world. These references are on your handout too. Satan is the God of this age. He owns all the authority of all the kingdoms, holds the power of death. And my personal favorite is that he's the one who planted the weeds in the wheat field. Do you remember that parable? And Jesus has to explain it to the disciples. And he says, do you remember what he says? They said, well, who sowed the weeds in the field? Because this farmer didn't. And Jesus said, an enemy has done this. Do you remember? And the disciples asked, well, shouldn't the servants take the weeds out, pull the weeds? And Jesus said, no, don't do that, because you may pull wheat with it and mess up your field. At the end, during the harvest or the end of the age, the angels will do the separating of the wheat and the weeds. So, anyway, I like that one. An enemy has done this. I say that around the house a lot now. Bad things I say. An enemy has done this. So also, Jesus speaks a lot about Satan's activity. In 1 John, it says, the Son of God was revealed for this purpose, to destroy the works of the devil. And Jesus said in Luke 13, should not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has kept bound for 18 long years, be set free on the Sabbath? And then in Hebrews, it says, Christ came to break the power of him who holds the power of death. That is the devil. Now, Satan doesn't have a hold on us if we're believers. So he no longer has, the power of death doesn't have hold on us either, right? But this is Satan's work in the world. And my point in bringing these out to you is just to get you in that mindset, because if spiritual beings can directly interact with humans in the material world, I find that it's reasonable to think they could also be negligent in their duties. So that's not a far stretch for me. If Satan can be active in the world, he could also be negligent. And this is why I'm harping on that. One of the objections, this is SpongeBob. Y'all know SpongeBob, don't you? Yeah. Yes. Well, yeah, it's in Job. Yeah. I could look up some more, but yeah, that one is the one that comes to mind. And he's in the garden. He's the serpent, so we know that from Revelation, tells that the serpent of old, the ancient serpent of old, is Satan. Well, I think also if you look up how God talks about the sons of God, the angels that were put in charge of the nations at Babel, and what they did to the nations by corrupting them, and they took honor and praise for themselves. Those angels did, the sons of God. And God judged them. So, and he's going to judge them too in the end. But yeah. So it's not, so you think of it just being Satan, but it's also more than just one being also, right? And I can look up some more for you. But SpongeBob objects that this doesn't seem the divine action. So this is he's objecting to the direct action theodicy. And the reason why is because natural evils seem to be a little random and indifferent. They're not, they're very random, like I'm talking about tornadoes, hurricanes, and even the development of animals. So remember I said there were two ways to look at fallen angel theodicy. One is the omission theodicy. So the omission theodicy, to me, makes better sense of the apparent randomness and indifference of natural evils, because the fallen angel's negligence kind of makes sense of the default tendency of evolution to produce nature, red tooth and claw, right? Predation, violence, and parasites. So if they were neglecting their duty and let it all run its course, they weren't paying attention, and that's kind of what then we have predation, violence, and parasites and diseases and stuff. Does that make sense? So I prefer that only for this. Yeah, Emma?
I guess if people are like proponents of direct action, what would they say like spiritual powers would do to directly cause predation, violence, and parasites?
So in this, they would say like they're meddling in the natural selection and and everything of evolution and making choices to have them be violent and, you know.
And that seems just like less probable to you?
I think it seems very directed and has a lot, like you would have to have forethought about it instead of being, if you're negligent and you're not doing your duty like you should, you rebelled, basically. You rebelled against God's order to make it like he designed, then it seems like it would run kind of randomly like this. Especially, I think it makes more sense for natural disasters or natural evil like weather events. And also, Alvin might say, well, we know the reason for hurricanes. We know the natural laws that make earthquakes and everything. So why do we need a demon to be doing any of this, right? So or to be acting on it, right? Reaching in, and so the omission is more that he's fallen down on the job, rebelled that way. But there's a lot of people that do believe in direct action theodicy as well. Yes?
Is there argument that it's a mix of both?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's not all evil, because creation is good too, right? So because God's over it all, he didn't let them totally destroy creation, right? And someone I read said, well, it wouldn't be to their benefit to make it all evil, because that would just expose them, and we wouldn't want to follow their evil designs, because that would make it too evident. So it's mixed. So we've explained a major part of the problem of animal suffering. We can see why it matters. And we've offered a solution that is consistent with God's nature and the Christian worldview. And oh, good. So we do have time for questions. So the takeaways for me are The omission theodicy, along with God's ultimate defeat of evil in the afterlife, is a reasonable solution to part of the problem of animal suffering. An enemy has done this, but he will ultimately be defeated. And we should stress that this is speculative, and it's okay to say, I could be wrong. But you said more, like we've said more in the last 45 minutes. I mean, at least we have been thinking about this problem, correct? Do you think that Alvin is more able to listen and not just shut us down if we present this as something instead of just saying, well, God has reasons that we don't know? What do you think? I'm just saying for an atheist or skeptic, to give them a pat answer like that that doesn't tell them anything doesn't show that you care enough to actually study and come up with, infer something from the biblical data. We live in an already not yet time of paradox, where God calls believers to cooperate with him in rescuing the world from these destructive forces. Okay. Oh, and these are the resources. You could, if you wanted to study more. Addie.
So, because I'm doing research on the divine council, there's a lot of people who would disagree with the divine council, even among Christians, being claimed and the use of sons of God to mean specifically angels. So, what are some, like, do you have evidence other than just we know that the fall of angels happened before, other than those scriptures that mention them as being part of the divine council, that other Christians would be more willing to use even if they don't agree with it?
Yeah, if they've never heard of the divine council and aren't into that, like we are, you could just simply say spiritual beings. They know that spiritual beings were created. You can with biblical data say that they were created before the world. So you could just say that. You wouldn't have to bring in the sons of God. I just feel like that explains why they were given. That explains their responsibilities.
Yeah, I guess that's what I'm getting at. Like, for people who won't agree with the divine council, maybe they don't agree with the angels having responsibilities. Like, what would they maybe?
Well, you can use biblical data to support that. Yeah, I would go that way.
Okay.
And then just infer that it could be, since we see that they're given responsibilities, that it could be that they were given responsibility for creation and animals. Yeah.
So one of your takeaways is that God calls us to cooperate with him in rescuing the world from these destructive forces. So what do you think Christians are obligated to do about animal suffering?
No factory farming. No, I'm kidding. I mean, for one, right? No, don't buy factory farm meat. And for humans, don't abuse animals. I mean, I don't know what you want. I haven't thought about that. What would you do?
That's why I asked you.
Yeah.
I could take a stab at it. I think you might be getting at, like, should all Christians be vegans?
Yeah.
Or...
Well, we have, after the flood, God gives us, he says we can eat, huh?
He gives us dominion to eat the animals.
Yeah, he does.
But he does also say that he cares about the animals. So I think that when you're going about, like, how God would want you to treat animals, I think it might be easier to think about how God himself would treat animals and look to scripture to say, like, he didn't want to destroy Nineveh because of all the cattle. He didn't want to cause reckless, unnecessary animal suffering that he himself caused. It was not like a natural evil of the world. And so, like, we should aim to also not recklessly destroy animal life by, like, say, blowing up a bunch of cattle in a field for no reason. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Now,
my husband does subdue creation because the bunny rabbits eat his garden.
But he has reason.
And he has reason. They're eating all of our peas. And so he does try to shoot them, but he hasn't been very successful. I'm sorry. I mean, I'm just being honest.
I'll talk to you about it later.
He doesn't poison them or anything.
Why?
Yeah. What? Yeah, Aiden.
I was going to say, that's a practical thing. If and when people develop safe lab-grown meat for mass consumption, that'd be a good option.
They're doing it. They are developing that.
That's
Yeah.
why I said if and when.
Right, if and when, yeah. And if it's, yeah, Harry.
Now, would you say this is a common objection that you encounter in real life?
Do y'all encounter? I think you're going to because of that. Because it's a big objection for atheists and skeptics.
Is it? Because from my perspective, this seems to be a very modern Western problem. Because when I was growing up in China, in fact, you go to many underdeveloped countries in the world, this is not on people's minds.
They're not thinking about it. Yeah.
I mean, the way I was brought up, we never thought there's anything intrinsically evil about animal suffering. That was just the way of the world. So I would actually find the idea that animal suffering is just not morally significant enough. I would find that personally more convincing than going into the details of the divine counsel.
Yeah. I don't like that answer.
Yeah, well, see,
Yeah.
personally, I find that convincing.
Okay.
When
Well, that's good because that's a simpler
If
answer.
I were to talk to people about it, I guess I would try to kind of change the whole worldview about this whole like very modern idea that we need to decenter humanity from the world. I would kind of like take that approach and say, no, we need to recenter humanity. And once we get to that point, this ceases to be a problem. At least I think that's how a lot of non-Western countries would think about this. Like we just don't elevate animal as high as you do.
I do. I think, and in medieval and earlier, they didn't either.
Exactly. So
Right.
That's why I
Right.
say modern Western countries.
Yeah. I totally agree with that. You had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, actually, I'll build off of that and then I'm asking a question. I think that sort of points to this idea that moral objectivity is sort of the tendency in society raised in the culture here in a third developing country where human development is something that hasn't matured. You're obviously going to prioritize that before you consider the suffering of other beings, animals. And so that can kind of tilt towards the idea of is there an objective moral standard code? Are we pointing towards that? Is human society progressing towards that? C.S. Lewis would obviously argue no, but it would be sort of implied if there is this all-powerful God above us. But I digress. My question is, you initially mentioned the idea of sort of willing destruction. You mentioned animal sacrifice. You mentioned the killing of animals, such as Canaan, and maybe even the flood. Do you have any more discussion on that? And sort of
I don't. I think we should discuss it in the afterthought. Those are the other pieces of the objection to animal suffering is divine action, divine commands to the Canaanites, and animal sacrifice. Yeah, all those things. Like there's a lot of animals that died in the flood. What are we going to do about that? Did God? What?
Well, I think it's sort of having this is what you initially mentioned, and it kind of leads to the idea that God is either A, not moral, or B, not powerful. If that is true,
Those other. I think you could go with what was the purpose? Was there any teleology in?
By extension, what is God's purpose and motivation? Because at the end
Well, for the flood, we know, and we could blame it on human evil. We could, right?
always will exist. And so it kind of comes into the question of what is purpose if nothing changes ultimately for your own existence.
Yeah.
But that's separate from this discussion.
Yeah. So I didn't get into all those. Those are the other worms in the can. Yeah.
I think we're going to have to cut it off.
Oh, we have.
We're over time.
Well,
We can keep talking
yeah.
outside.
Go ahead.
Oh, if God is all-knowing, then is God not